The morning sun of Zentari Prime cast long shadows across the massive training grounds of the Galactic Military Academy. Thousands of alien cadets from across the galaxy moved in perfect formations, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes that would have amazed any human observer. But humans were barely noticed here, relegated to the background like furniture that nobody paid attention to. Zektar strutted across the polished stone courtyard, his crystalline exoskeleton catching the light and throwing brilliant reflections in all directions. His sister Velnari walked beside him, equally magnificent in her natural armor that had been passed down through generations of Vorthak warriors. They were the pride of their species, descendants of the great Admiral Korthax, who had conquered the Spiral Nebula 3,000 years ago. "Brother, did you see the pathetic display from the humans during combat drills yesterday?" Velnari clicked through her mandibles, the sound carrying clearly across the courtyard. Several nearby cadets turned their heads to listen, always eager to hear the latest gossip from the Academy's most influential students. Zektar's compound eyes sparkled with cruel amusement as he recalled the scene. "Oh yes, the one called Jake." Morrison nearly fainted when Instructor Throck demonstrated the plasma cannon. His face turned that disgusting pale color they get when frightened. "I thought he might actually vomit right there on the training deck." The memory brought delighted laughter from both siblings. Around them, other students began to gather, drawn by the promise of entertainment at human expense. There was Crix, towering nearly 12 feet tall with muscles that could crush steel, representing the mighty Malaxi Empire that had never lost a single battle in recorded history. His people were born warriors, trained from childhood to see combat as the highest form of art. This slithered closer on her serpentine lower body, her scaled form moving with liquid grace. The Nagon were known throughout the galaxy for their tactical brilliance, able to calculate battle outcomes with mathematical precision. Her species had advised winning generals for over 5 millennia, and their strategic insights were sought by every major military power. "My honored father serves on the Galactic Council," Thys announced with obvious pride, her forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "He shared most amusing news during our last communication. The humans have been placed under official Class 7 military restrictions." The gathered aliens fell silent for a moment, processing this information. Class 7 restrictions were reserved for species deemed unfit for military service due to fundamental weaknesses or psychological instability. It was a classification that brought shame to any race unlucky enough to receive it. "What does this mean?" "Exactly," asked Gorix, a four-armed Zentari cadet whose natural camouflage abilities made him nearly invisible against the academy walls. Thys preened at being the center of attention, her scales shifting to a deeper shade of green that indicated pleasure among her kind. "It means no combat deployments, no access to heavy weapons, no frontline positions, no command authority over non-human forces. They are officially recognized as too fragile and emotionally unstable for real warfare." The laughter that erupted from the group was loud enough to echo off the Academy's towering spires. Cadets from dozens of different species joined in, their various sounds of amusement creating a symphony of mockery. Some made exaggerated weeping sounds, others mimicked the way humans stumbled when trying to carry standard military equipment. "That other species handled easily. I heard from my combat instructor that during their last deployment, an entire human unit broke down completely," Crix rumbled, his deep voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "They were supposed to clear a simple rebel outpost, but instead, they sat in their transport crying and refusing to follow orders. The Altarian forces had to complete the mission while babysitting these emotional weaklings." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Several aliens began imitating what they imagined human soldiers looked like in combat, stumbling around with exaggerated fear expressions and making whimpering sounds. The performance was so convincing that even some of the normally serious Corvin cadets cracked their stone-like faces with smiles. Not far away, near the Academy's communications building, Jake Morrison tried to ignore the sounds of mockery as he worked on calibrating a subspace relay. His hands moved steadily over the complex equipment, but his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Beside him, Lisa Campbell continued her work on a navigation computer, her face carefully neutral despite the growing knot of anger in her stomach. "Let them laugh," Lisa whispered, without looking up from her screen. "They have no idea what they're talking about." Jake's fingers paused over the relay controls. "It's not fair, Lisa. We both know the real reason for the restrictions, and it has nothing to do with being weak or unstable." "Keep your voice down," Lisa warned, glancing around, to make sure no alien instructors were within hearing range. "The truth isn't something they're ready to understand. Maybe they never will be." Back in the courtyard, the mockery was reaching new heights of creativity. Velnari had begun a detailed impression of a human soldier trying to lift a standard plasma rifle, complete with exaggerated grunting sounds and stumbling motions. Her performance was so entertaining that cadets were calling others over to watch. "Perhaps we should suggest to the Academy administration that humans be moved to a separate facility," Zektar proposed with mock seriousness. "Somewhere they can learn basic life skills without embarrassing themselves in front of real warriors. Maybe a cooking school or a child care center would be more appropriate for their limited abilities." The suggestion brought fresh waves of laughter from the crowd. Several aliens began offering their own ideas for where humans might be better suited. Suggestions ranged from janitorial services to pet grooming, each proposal more insulting than the last. Instructor Gorvash approached the group, with his characteristic heavy footsteps that announced his presence long before he became visible. The scarred Krillian veteran had lost 3 limbs in combat before getting them replaced with military-grade cybernetics that were actually superior to his original biological parts. His reputation for toughness was legendary throughout the Academy. "What seems to be amusing you cadets?" Gorvash asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Honored instructor, we were discussing the recent news about human military restrictions," Thys replied respectfully. "We find it curious that a species advanced enough for space travel could be so fundamentally unsuited for military service." Gorvash's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his cybernetic eyes. "Indeed, most curious. I trust you will remember to treat your human classmates with appropriate courtesy despite their limitations." "Of course, honored." "Instructor," the aliens replied in unison, though their barely suppressed grins suggested otherwise. As Gorvash moved away, the mockery resumed with even greater enthusiasm. None of the alien students noticed the way the instructor's mechanical fingers tapped a complex pattern against his leg, or how his cybernetic eye lingered on the distant figures of Jake and Lisa working quietly at their stations. The truth about human restrictions was far more complex than any of these young aliens could imagine, but for now, their ignorance served a purpose that none of them would understand until it was far too late. The weeks that followed brought an escalation in the treatment of human cadets that would have shocked observers from more civilized parts of the galaxy. What had started as casual mockery transformed into systematic harassment that seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. The alien students, emboldened by what they saw as official confirmation of human inferiority from the Galactic Council itself, began treating their human classmates as amusing pets rather than fellow cadets. Zektar and Velnari had become the unofficial leaders of this campaign of humiliation. They created new games that involved making humans perform simple tasks while timing them against alien cadets, always ensuring the contests were designed for human failure. When Jake Morrison struggled to carry a standard Vorthak battle pack that weighed nearly twice what human equipment typically weighed, the twins would click their mandibles in exaggerated sympathy. "Poor little Jake," Velnari would coo in mock concern. Perhaps we should find you something more appropriate for your delicate constitution. Maybe a child's training pack would be better suited to your capabilities." The other aliens would laugh at these displays, but their amusement had taken on a cruel edge that made even some of the instructors uncomfortable. This had begun keeping a running tally of human failures during training exercises, announcing the count loudly enough for everyone to hear. When Lisa Campbell missed a target during weapons practice, this would slither over with exaggerated concern. "That makes 47 misses this week for the humans," she would announce to anyone within earshot. "Perhaps their vision is too poor for military applications. I have heard that some species use humans as decorative pets because they are pleasant to look at but not useful for practical purposes." Crix had developed his own form of entertainment that involved challenging humans to arm wrestling matches. His massive Malaxi strength made these contests laughably one-sided, but he would always act surprised when he won within seconds. The 12-foot warrior would scratch his head in apparent confusion and wonder aloud how beings so weak had ever survived long enough to develop space travel. The harassment extended beyond just physical challenges. During academic classes, alien students would whisper loudly about human mental limitations whenever Jake or Lisa answered questions. Even correct answers were dismissed as lucky guesses or simple memorization rather than true understanding. When Lisa demonstrated her expertise with communication systems by solving a complex signal routing problem that had stumped several Zentari cadets, Gorix simply shrugged. "Humans probably have good memories for repetitive tasks," he said dismissively, "like trained animals that can perform tricks on command. But real tactical thinking requires intelligence that their species simply lacks." The dining hall became another venue for creative humiliation. Alien cadets would offer to cut human food into smaller pieces, claiming they were worried about choking hazards. They would speak slowly and use simple words when addressing humans, as if talking to children or beings with limited comprehension. Some aliens began bringing their own eating utensils to avoid contamination from tools that humans had touched. Jake found himself assigned to increasingly menial tasks during training exercises, while alien cadets practiced complex maneuvers and tactical planning. He was given jobs like equipment maintenance and supply counting. When he tried to volunteer for more challenging assignments, instructors would pat him on the head condescendingly and suggest that he focus on tasks more suited to his abilities. The breaking point came during a joint tactical simulation class taught by instructor Gorvash. The scarred Krillian veteran had decided to run a complex wargaming exercise that would test the strategic thinking of his most advanced students. Teams would be assigned to control different military units in a simulated battle scenario that had been based on real conflicts from galactic history. "Today we will examine the Battle of Zerion Prime," Gorvash announced to the assembled cadets. This engagement required sophisticated coordination between multiple fleet elements and ground forces. Each team will be responsible for commanding a full battle group in response to evolving tactical situations. The instructor began assigning cadets to different teams, carefully balancing the various alien species to create diverse groups that could learn from each other's unique perspectives. When he placed Jake on a team with 3 Vorthak cadets and Lisa on another team with several Nagan strategists, Zektar immediately raised his crystalline hand. "Honored Instructor Gorvash," the young Vorthak said with barely concealed amusement. "Surely it would be unfair to burden real warriors with the responsibility of compensating for human limitations during such a complex exercise. My teammates and I are concerned that we will spend more time explaining basic concepts than actually learning advanced tactics." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the classroom. Velnari nodded enthusiastically at her brother's words, while other alien cadets began voicing similar concerns. Thais raised her scaled head and flicked her tongue thoughtfully. "Perhaps the humans could serve as observers," she suggested with false helpfulness. "They might learn something useful by watching how real military minds approach strategic problems. It would be educational for them without creating difficulties for the rest of us." The classroom erupted in alien laughter at this suggestion. Even some of the typically serious Corvan cadets seemed to find humor in the idea of humans as passive observers to real military planning. Several aliens began making exaggerated note-taking motions, mimicking how they imagined humans might desperately try to understand concepts beyond their reach. Instructor Gorvash surveyed the classroom with his cybernetic eyes, taking in the mixture of amusement and expectation on the alien faces. His scarred features remained impassive, but Jake thought he detected something that might have been disappointment in the veteran's expression. After a long moment, Gorvash nodded slowly. "Very well," the instructor rumbled. "Morrison and Campbell will serve as tactical advisors to their respective teams, non-combatant roles only. They may observe and offer suggestions, but all actual command decisions will be made by their alien teammates." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks as the classroom dissolved into fresh laughter. The humiliation of being demoted to advisor status in front of his peers was bad enough, but the casual way it had been dismissed as perfectly reasonable made it even worse. He caught Lisa's eye across the room and saw his own frustration reflected in her expression. As the class broke into their assigned teams, Jake found himself relegated to a corner chair while his Vorthak teammates huddled around the tactical display. They spoke in their native clicking language, occasionally glancing at him with expressions that mixed amusement with pity. When he tried to point out a potential weakness in their defensive positioning, Zektar waved a dismissive hand. "Thank you, Jake, but I think we understand military strategy better than you do," the alien said with patronizing kindness. "Why don't you just watch and try to learn something that might be useful for your future career in supply management?" The words stung more than Jake cared to admit, but he forced himself to remain silent. Across the room, Lisa was receiving similar treatment from her Negan teammates, who had assigned her the task of taking notes while they handled the real strategic thinking. What none of the alien students noticed was the way several instructors exchanged meaningful glances during the exercise. Professor Yith-Ara, an elderly Altarian who taught advanced military history, seemed particularly troubled by the display. She whispered something to Instructor Gorvash that made the Krillian's cybernetic eye flash with what might have been recognition. The simulation began and alien teams started making their tactical decisions. Jake found himself studying their approaches with growing interest. The strategies being employed were competent but predictable, following established patterns that had been taught in military academies for generations. There was nothing innovative or unexpected in their thinking, just careful application of proven techniques. Lisa caught his attention and made a subtle gesture toward her tablet. When Jake looked, he saw that she had been taking real notes, but not about tactics. Instead, she had been documenting access codes and security protocols that appeared on the various displays around the classroom. Her expression suggested she had discovered something important, but they would have to wait until after class to discuss it. The exercise continued for another hour, with alien teams proudly demonstrating their mastery of conventional military doctrine. When Gorvash finally called time, the various groups presented their solutions with obvious satisfaction. The strategies were solid and would likely have achieved their objectives, though none showed particular creativity or innovation. As cadets filed out of the classroom, Jake and Lisa lingered behind to help clean up equipment. When they were alone, Lisa moved closer and spoke in a whisper that could barely be heard. "I managed to access some restricted files during the exercise," she said quietly. "There are classified records about human military deployments that tell a very different story than what these aliens believe. We need to find somewhere private where we can examine what I found." Jake nodded, his anger from the day's humiliation beginning to transform into something else entirely. The academy corridors were dimly lit during the night cycle, creating long shadows that provided perfect cover for two human cadets who had no business being in the restricted sections of the facility. Lisa Campbell moved through the darkness, With practiced stealth, her years of communication training having taught her how to avoid the various sensor systems that monitored student movement throughout the complex. Behind her, Jake Morrison followed silently, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror at what they were attempting. They had waited until the third sleep cycle to make their move, ensuring that even the most dedicated alien students would be deep in whatever regenerative processes their species required. The Vorthak twins were probably hanging upside down in their crystalline sleep pods, while Thess would be coiled in the thermal chambers that kept her serpentine body at optimal temperature. None of them would be awake to witness what was about to unfold. Lisa led the way to a maintenance access panel hidden behind a holographic display showing Academy achievements from the past century. Her fingers worked quickly over the access codes she had memorized during the tactical simulation, grateful that her human memory seemed to retain technical details better than most alien species realized. The panel slid open with barely a whisper, revealing a narrow corridor that maintenance crews used to service the Academy's vast computer networks. "Are you sure about this?" Jake whispered as they crawled through the cramped space toward the central data core. "No," Lisa replied honestly, "but I need to know the truth about why we're really restricted. The official story doesn't make sense when you look at the actual deployment records I glimpsed during class." They emerged into the heart of the Academy's information systems, a vast chamber filled with crystalline storage matrices that contained the military knowledge of a dozen different species. The soft blue glow from the processing units cast eerie shadows on the walls, making both humans feel like intruders in some alien temple. Lisa approached the main terminal with reverence, knowing that what she was about to attempt could result in immediate expulsion or worse. The security systems protecting classified military records were among the most sophisticated in the galaxy, designed to prevent unauthorized access by any species. But Lisa had spent years studying communication protocols and encryption methods, partly because she enjoyed the intellectual challenge, and partly because she suspected that human restrictions went far deeper than anyone was willing to admit. Her fingers moved across the holographic interface with growing confidence as layers of protection began to fall away. "How did you learn to do this?" Jake asked in amazement as he watched her work through security barriers that would have stopped most professional hackers. "Humans seem to have a natural talent for understanding information systems," Lisa replied without looking away from her work. "I think our brains process data patterns differently than other species. Most aliens rely on brute force computational power, but we find elegant solutions that work around the problems instead of trying to overwhelm them." The first breakthrough came when Lisa discovered that human access codes had been deliberately designed with hidden backdoors that allowed for emergency override situations. Someone in the galactic command structure had apparently decided that humans might need access to classified information under specific circumstances, even if they weren't supposed to know such access existed. "Look at this," Lisa breathed, as new directories appeared on her screen. "There are thousands of classified files about human military operations that have been sealed under Council Order 77 Alpha. That's the highest security classification in the galactic legal system." Jake leaned closer to read over her shoulder, struggling to understand the significance of what they were seeing. The file names alone were enough to make his blood run cold. Operation Crimson Dawn, the Kepler 4I-42 incident, Human Psychological Assessment, Post-Combat, Emergency Council Session Transcript, Devourer Species Threat Analysis. "Lisa, I think we should stop," Jake said quietly. "These files are classified for a reason. Maybe we're not supposed to know what's in them." But Lisa was already opening the first file, her curiosity overcoming her caution. What appeared on the screen made both humans fall silent with shock. It was a complete military record from 6 months earlier, detailing a conflict that neither of them had ever heard mentioned in any of their classes or official briefings. The Kepler 442 system had been under attack by something called the Devourers, a species that was described in the files as one of the most savage and destructive forces the galaxy had ever encountered. 3 separate alien fleets had attempted to stop their advance and failed catastrophically. The casualty reports made for grim reading, with entire civilizations being consumed by an enemy that seemed to view other species as nothing more than food sources. The humans were called in as a last resort, Lisa read aloud from the tactical summary. High Command estimated a 97% probability of mission failure based on previous engagement data. Human forces were deployed with the understanding that this represented a suicide mission with minimal chance of success. Jake studied the personnel files that accompanied the mission briefing. The names were simple and unremarkable. Commander Ben Hayes, Captain Amy Torres, Lieutenant Nick Parker, Sergeant Carl Brooks, Corporal Dana White. Just ordinary human soldiers with standard military training, not elite special forces or genetically enhanced super soldiers. They looked like people he might have known back on Earth. Here's what I don't understand, Jake said as he continued reading. If this was such a hopeless mission, why are their psychological evaluation reports dated after the engagement? That suggests the humans survived whatever happened at Kepler 442. Lisa opened the psychological files and immediately wished she hadn't. The reports painted a picture of human soldiers so traumatized by their combat experience that military psychiatrists recommended immediate intervention and long-term therapy. But the details of what had caused this trauma were carefully redacted, leaving only clinical descriptions of symptoms that sounded more like descriptions of predators than soldiers. Subject displays extreme agitation when asked to describe engagement protocols, Lisa read from one evaluation. Becomes violent when questioned about the elimination of enemy civilian populations. Required full restraint when discussing the systematic destruction of devourer breeding facilities. Recommend immediate psychological intervention and permanent removal from active duty status. Another report was even more disturbing. Subject shows no remorse for actions taken during the cleansing operations. When asked if alternative methods might have been more appropriate, Subject responded that complete elimination was the only logical solution. Subject appears to view the extinction of the devourer species as a successful outcome rather than a tragedy. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he read report after report describing human soldiers who had apparently been transformed by combat into something that terrified their own military psychiatrists. These weren't descriptions of broken warriors suffering from battle fatigue. They sounded like clinical assessments of efficient predators who had simply done what needed to be done. There has to be more, Lisa said as she continued searching through the classified archives. These psychological reports reference combat footage and tactical recordings that should be stored somewhere in the system. Her search led them deeper, into the restricted databases, past layers of security that had been specifically designed to prevent access to the most sensitive military intelligence in galactic history. What they found made both humans understand why the footage had been buried so deeply that even most government officials probably didn't know it existed. The video files were enormous, containing complete combat recordings from multiple human vessels and ground units during the entire Kepler 442 campaign. Each file was marked with warning symbols in 17 different alien languages, and the access logs showed that only a handful of individuals had ever viewed the complete recordings. Jake, Lisa said quietly as she prepared to open the first video file. I think we're about to see something that's going to change how we understand our own species. Jake nodded grimly, though part of him wanted to flee back to their dormitories and pretend they had never discovered these files. But the need to know the truth about human military restrictions was stronger than his fear of what that truth might reveal. Do it, he said simply. Lisa activated the first video file, and they found themselves looking through the helmet camera of Commander Ben Hayes aboard the human vessel UNS Dakota. The timestamp showed it was recorded 6 months earlier at the EO beginning of what would become known as the Kepler 442 incident. Neither of them was prepared for what they were about to witness. or how it would fundamentally change their understanding of why the galaxy was so afraid of their species that even the mention of human combat capabilities had been classified beyond the reach of most government officials. The truth about human, military restrictions was about to reveal itself in all its terrifying glory. The video began with Commander Ben Hayes standing on the bridge of the UNS Dakota, his calm voice cutting through the quiet hum of ship systems as his crew prepared for what everyone expected to be their final mission. The human fleet approached. The Kepler 442 system, where Devourer ships swarmed like hungry insects around 3 dying planets. Jake and Lisa watched in fascination as the initial moments unfolded with professional military precision that would have impressed even their alien instructors. "All stations report ready, Commander," came the voice of Captain Amy Torres from her position at the tactical station. Her tone was steady and controlled, showing none of the fear that intelligence reports suggested should have been overwhelming human forces at this point. "Remember, people, the whole galaxy is watching this." "Engagement," Hayes replied over the ship's communication system. "3 alien fleets have already failed here. Let's show them what humanity can accomplish when we put our minds to it." The first contact with Devourer forces seemed almost routine. Human ships moved with calculated precision, their weapons firing in patterns that demonstrated sophisticated tactical coordination. Lisa noted that the human formation was unlike anything taught at the academy, flowing and adaptive rather than following rigid geometric arrangements that most alien species preferred. "They fight like a pack," Jake observed quietly as he watched. "The human vessels coordinate their attacks. Each ship seems to know what the others are thinking without constant communication." The Devourers responded to the human assault with their signature terror weapon, a subsonic roar broadcast across all communication frequencies that had broken the morale of countless alien warriors throughout their expansion across the galaxy. The sound was designed to trigger primal fear responses in most sentient species, causing panic and confusion that made organized resistance nearly impossible. But as Jake and Lisa watched in amazement, something completely unexpected happened. When the Devourer war cry reached the human fleet, instead of the fear and panic that had destroyed alien morale in previous engagements, the humans seemed to become more focused and deadly. The change was subtle at first, just a slight alteration in voice tones and movement patterns, but it grew more pronounced with each passing minute. "Did you hear that, boys and girls?" Hayes said over the communication system, and there was something new in his voice now, something hungry and anticipating. "They think they've already won this fight." What followed made both human cadets understand why the footage had been classified at the highest levels of galactic security. The human ships didn't simply engage the Devourer fleet in conventional combat. They began hunting them with a methodical persistence that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. When a damaged Devourer cruiser attempted to retreat from the battle zone, 3 human vessels immediately broke formation to pursue it. They followed the wounded ship across 2 star systems, never stopping to rest or resupply, maintaining pursuit through asteroid fields and radiation storms that should have been impossible to navigate. The chase continued for 18 hours, until they cornered their prey against a stellar gravity well and systematically tore it apart. "Target their engines first," Captain Torres instructed her gunners during the pursuit. "I want them alive long enough to know what's happening to them." The ground combat footage was even more disturbing. Human Marines moved through Devourer positions like apex predators stalking wounded prey. They didn't simply eliminate enemy combatants and secure objectives as military doctrine required. Instead, they systematically dismantled every aspect of Devourer civilization they encountered with a thoroughness that went far beyond normal military requirements. "Captain Torres, we've located the primary spawning complex," reported Lieutenant Nick Parker through his helmet communication system. His voice carried no emotion despite the significance of what he was describing. "Request permission to proceed with sterilization protocols." "Permission granted," Torres replied immediately. "Make sure nothing survives to reproduce. We want this species to remember what happens when they threaten human worlds." Jake and Lisa watched in stunned silence as Parker's squad methodically destroyed not just the Devourer military facilities, but every trace of their ability to continue as a species. Breeding pools were drained and filled with toxic compounds. Genetic storage facilities were burned to ash. Young Devourers, who might have grown to become future warriors, were eliminated with clinical efficiency. The most chilling moment came when Parker's squad encountered a group of Devourer civilians, huddled in what appeared to be a shelter. In any other species' military doctrine, this would have been a moment for taking prisoners or showing mercy to non-combatants. The footage showed Parker's face through his helmet visor, calm and almost serene as he studied the terrified aliens. "No witnesses," he said simply to his squad. "No survivors. No future generations to seek revenge." The video feed went dark for several seconds, and when it resumed, Parker's squad was already moving toward their next objective. There was no discussion of what had happened in the shelter, no acknowledgement that they had just crossed lines that most civilized species wouldn't even consider approaching. As the footage continued, Jake and Lisa began to understand the true scope of what had occurred at Kepler 442. The humans hadn't simply defeated the Devourer invasion force. They had systematically hunted down and exterminated every trace of Devourer presence across 17 different star systems. Ships, soldiers, civilians, genetic material, cultural artifacts, historical records, everything was destroyed with methodical completeness. "Look at the tactical displays," Lisa whispered as she pointed to data streams showing human fleet movements. "They're not just fighting a military campaign. They're conducting a species-wide extermination operation." The final video files showed human forces conducting what they called cleansing operations on worlds that had been conquered by the Devourers decades earlier. Even planets where Devourers had intermingled with local populations were subjected to complete sterilization protocols that ensured no genetic traces of the enemy species could survive. Commander Hayes appeared in the final recording, standing on the bridge of his ship as it departed the Kepler 442 system. Behind him, through the view screen, 3 planets burned with fires that would continue for months until every organic molecule that might have carried Devourer genetic material had been reduced to sterile ash. "Mission accomplished," Hayes reported to Galactic Command. "The Devourer species has been rendered extinct. All genetic samples, cultural artifacts, and technological remnants have been destroyed. There is no possibility of resurrection or recovery." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were reporting the completion of a routine supply mission rather than the deliberate extinction of an entire sentient species. There was no remorse in his voice, no acknowledgement of the magnitude of what had been accomplished. To him, the complete elimination of the Devourers was simply a successful outcome that had achieved its strategic objectives. The video files ended with timestamp data showing that the entire operation had been completed in 72 hours. 3 days to hunt down and eliminate every trace of a species that had terrorized the galaxy for generations. The efficiency was as impressive as it was horrifying. Jake and Lisa sat in stunned silence as the final video faded to black. Around them, the soft blue glow of the data core seemed less comforting than it had before, as if the very technology they were using had been contaminated by what they had witnessed. "Now I understand the psychological evaluations," Lisa said, quietly. "The military psychiatrists weren't dealing with traumatized soldiers suffering from combat stress. They were trying to evaluate humans who had methodically exterminated an entire species and felt perfectly justified in having done so." Jake nodded slowly, his mind struggling to process what they had seen. "The Class 7 restriction isn't about protecting us from the horrors of war. It's about protecting everyone else from what we become when we decide that war is the answer to a problem." Neither of them spoke for several minutes as they absorbed the implications of what they had discovered. The footage had answered their questions about human military restrictions, but the answers were far more disturbing than either had expected. They finally understood why the galaxy treated their species with such casual contempt, while simultaneously ensuring they were never allowed near real weapons or combat situations. The truth about humanity's nature in warfare was too dangerous for the galaxy to acknowledge openly, so it had been buried beneath layers of classification and hidden behind a fiction about human weakness. It was easier for everyone to believe that humans were fragile and emotionally unstable than to confront the reality of what they were capable of when truly threatened. As they prepared to leave the data core and return to their dormitories, neither Jake nor Lisa noticed the small recording device that had been monitoring their activities, or the alien figure watching them from the shadows of the maintenance corridor. The truth they had discovered was about to spread far beyond their control. Jake and Lisa sat in the dim glow of the data core for what felt like hours, though the chronometer showed only minutes had passed since the final video file had ended. The silence between them was heavy, with the weight of understanding that neither had wanted to gain. They had sought the truth about human military restrictions, expecting to find evidence of bureaucratic prejudice or political maneuvering. Instead, they had discovered something far more unsettling about their own species. "We need to get back to our rooms," Lisa finally whispered, though her voice carried none of its usual confidence. "If we're caught here, they'll know we accessed classified files." Jake nodded but made no move to leave. His mind was still processing what they had witnessed, trying to reconcile the methodical extinction he had seen in the footage with everything he thought he knew about human nature. The soldiers in those videos had looked like ordinary people, the kind he might have served alongside if things had been different. "Lisa," he said quietly, "should we tell the others? The human cadets, I mean. They have a right to know why we're really restricted from military service." Lisa considered the question carefully as she began shutting down the systems they had used to access the classified archives. The footage they had seen painted humanity in a light that was both terrifying and oddly magnificent. They were not. The weak species that alien students mocked, but something far more dangerous than anyone at the academy suspected. "What would be the point?" she replied after a long moment. "Knowing the truth won't change our situation. We're still restricted from combat roles, still treated like inferior beings by every other species in the galaxy. The only difference would be that we'd know the real reason, and I'm not sure that knowledge would make any of us happier." Jake thought about the casual cruelty of the alien students, their constant mockery and assumption of human weakness. Part of him wanted them to know how wrong they were, to see the fear in their compound eyes when they realized what humans were truly capable of accomplishing when circumstances required it. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "Let them keep believing we're harmless. It's probably safer for everyone that way." They made their way back through the maintenance corridors toward their dormitories, moving carefully to avoid the sensor networks that monitored student movement during sleep cycles. Neither of them noticed the small surveillance device that had been recording their activities or the figure that watched them from the shadows as they departed the restricted areas. The next morning brought an atmosphere at the academy that felt subtly different, though Jake couldn't identify exactly what had changed. Alien students went about their usual routines of training and mockery, but several of the instructors seemed more watchful than normal. During breakfast, Jake caught Professor Yathara studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. The first sign that something significant had shifted came during the morning formation assembly. Commandant Vex Thul, the highest-ranking official at the academy, appeared on the central platform with an expression that suggested important announcements were forthcoming. The massive Altarian rarely addressed students directly, preferring to communicate through subordinate instructors. "Cadets," the commandant began in his resonant voice that carried easily across the assembly grounds. "It has come to my attention that certain classified materials have been accessed without proper authorization. This represents a serious breach of Academy security protocols." Jake felt his blood turn to ice as the commandant's words sank in. Beside him in the human section, Lisa maintained perfect composure, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Somehow their nocturnal expedition into the restricted archives had been discovered. However, Vexthul continued, and his tone suggested a change in direction that caught everyone's attention. Upon review of the materials in question, the faculty has determined that a broader educational opportunity has presented itself. The alien students began murmuring among themselves, clearly confused by the commandant's cryptic announcement. Zektar and Velnari exchanged puzzled glances, while Thys coiled and uncoiled nervously as she tried to understand what was happening. Effective immediately, all students will participate in a special historical review session focusing on recent military operations that have been previously classified, the commandant announced. The subject matter concerns human military capabilities and the circumstances surrounding current deployment restrictions. The murmuring among alien students grew louder as they processed this unexpected development. Jake realized with growing horror that somehow the classified footage they had accessed was about to be shown to the entire academy. The truth about human nature in warfare was going to be revealed to every species represented in the student body. Within an hour, the entire academy population had been assembled in the main auditorium, a vast chamber capable of accommodating thousands of beings from dozens of different species. The lighting dimmed as holographic projectors activated, and Jake found himself looking at the same interface he and Lisa had seen during their midnight investigation. "The footage you are about to witness," Professor Yathara announced from the podium, "documents actual combat operations conducted by human military forces 6 months ago. This material has been classified at the highest levels of galactic security until now." The first video began with Commander Ben Hayes on the bridge of the UNS Dakota, and Jake watched the faces of alien students as they saw human military personnel for the first time in actual combat situations. Initially, there was amusement and anticipation, as if they were about to witness confirmation of everything they believed about human weakness. That amusement died quickly as the footage progressed. Jake saw Zektar's crystalline features shift from mockery to confusion to something approaching fear as he watched human ships hunt devourer vessels with relentless persistence. Velnari's mandibles stopped clicking entirely as she witnessed the methodical efficiency with which human forces eliminated their enemies. The ground combat footage brought complete silence to the auditorium. Thousands of alien students watched, in stunned quiet as human marines moved through devourer positions like apex predators, systematically destroying every trace of their enemy's ability to survive as a species. The casual conversation between human soldiers as they conducted what amounted to genocide was more disturbing than any dramatic speeches or emotional outbursts would have been. When Lieutenant Nick Parker calmly ordered the elimination of devourer, civilians with the words, "No witnesses, no survivors, no future generations to seek revenge," Jake heard actual gasps from species throughout the auditorium. These were beings who had grown up believing that humans were too emotionally fragile for military service, watching footage of humans conducting the most thorough military campaign in recorded galactic history. The final video showing Commander Hayes reporting the complete extinction of the devourer species as if it were a routine mission accomplishment brought absolute silence to the massive chamber. Jake looked around and saw expressions of shock, fear, and dawning understanding on faces that had been filled with mockery just hours earlier. Commandant Vexthul returned to the podium as the footage ended, his imposing figure somehow seeming smaller in the wake of what had been revealed. "The Class 7 military restrictions placed upon human forces," he said in a voice that carried clearly through the silent auditorium, "were not implemented due to human weakness or emotional instability." He paused to let that statement sink in before continuing. "They were implemented because human military efficiency exceeds acceptable parameters for civilized warfare. The complete extinction of the devourer species was accomplished in 72 hours by forces that were considered a last resort deployment. Jake saw alien students throughout the auditorium, turning to stare at the small group of humans present. The expressions were no longer mocking or dismissive. Instead, they showed the kind of careful respect typically reserved for dangerous animals that might be friendly but could never be entirely trusted. The restrictions remain in place, the Commandant concluded, not to protect humanity from the challenges of military service, but to ensure that galactic conflicts do not escalate beyond the point where civilization itself becomes threatened. As the assembly disbanded and students began filing out of the auditorium, Jake found himself surrounded by a bubble of empty space as alien cadets instinctively maintained distance from the human section. The casual mockery and harassment that had defined his academy experience had been replaced by something that was almost worse. Fearful respect from beings who now understood exactly what humans were capable of accomplishing when they decided a problem needed to be solved permanently. Walking back to his dormitory, Jake reflected on the irony of their situation. They had sought the truth about human restrictions and found it, but the revelation had fundamentally changed how they would be treated by every other species in the galaxy. They were no longer seen as weak beings deserving of contempt, but as dangerous predators who needed to be carefully managed for everyone's safety. The truth had set them free from mockery, but it had also isolated them in ways that might prove even more difficult to bear. As he reached his room, Jake realized that some